I'm going to be responding today to the comments that you guys left on Tuesday's podcast, the title of which was The Rise of Alpha Females, aka She-Males. Today's podcast will be in video format and also in audio format. I recommend all of you to watch the video version at least once because I'll be showing certain things on screen by way of articles and evidence, which you obviously won't be able to view if you're only listening to the audio version. So let's get started. Big up Abs Boxing TV. Big up Luke. Luke says here, yo Hatman, I think you got the definition of she-male twisted, but take my word and don't Google it. No, shout out to Luke. I'm well aware that she-male generally refers to a transsexual or transgender, whatever you want to call them. I deliberately put that term in the title of Tuesday's podcast because females who, act a certain way, alpha females or boss bitches, whatever they want to call themselves, they're borderline transsexuals anyway, right? That's the reason that I put that particular term in the title. So I'm well aware of what she-male normally refers to. But big up Luke. Luke also says, I never understood the selling point of being a metrosexual male. It's all negatives in my view, which is why it's always astounded me how people want to be like that. For feminists, I get it. They want to be the dominant one and they build up some kind of complex around that. But why would a man want to be a bitch? Man, I agree, Luke. I don't know why a man would want to be a bitch or a metrosexual. I don't understand what the appeal is. Big up, Luke. Comment here from Abs Boxing TV. He said, Drake's back-to-back was not that special at all. To this day, I don't get why people big it up so much. And Pennies94 responded to Abs Boxing TV saying, nah, back-to-back was hard still. I'm with Abs on that one. I didn't get what was so great about Drake's diss track back-to-back. But then again, I don't really listen to a lot of contemporary music and maybe I didn't understand the references that Drake was making in the track. Pennies94 says, Shaquille O'Neal was actually raised by a military stepdad who treated him like his own son. He credits him for raising him to be the man he is today. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I knew that he wasn't raised by his biological dad. I had assumed that he was raised by a single mom, but according to what Pennies is saying, he was actually raised in a two-parent family with his mom and his stepdad, who was a military dad and, treated him like his own son. Okay, that makes sense then, because Shaquille O'Neal was a very self-assured, confident, alpha individual. He's not overly emotional or anything like that. So it makes sense. And that's not to say that you don't have some men who are raised by single moms that go on to be, self-assured men and what have you, because you do. You do get some like that. Next comment here from Gennady Alvarez. Big up Gennady. He says, he puts in quotation marks, I'm a boss bitch. Okay, first, you're not a boss. And more importantly, why are you calling yourself a bitch? Indeed, I agree, Gennady Alvarez. As I said in Tuesday's episode, I don't want nothing to do with no woman who calls herself a bitch. Not interested in that. I'm looking for somebody more mature who has more respect for themselves, not running around calling himself a bitch. That's crazy to me. How can I build a home and have kids with a woman who's running around calling herself a bitch? I'm looking for a lady. I'm looking for a woman, not a bitch. All right. Big up Gennady Alvarez. Pennies94 says, same reason guys call themselves niggers. Touche, Maybe you got a point there. Maybe I'll talk about that in a different podcast. Got a comment here from Implicit Bias. He says, you obsess about nurturing and the impact it has on kids, but the data suggests otherwise. There's plenty of evidence that shows gay couples and straight couples bringing up kids has zero effect on their sexuality and very little effect on their passions in life. Their peers are way more important in that role. In fact, parents are often shocked how little impact they have on their adopted kids. They expect some arty, creative kid but they be sporty instead. You have some interesting thoughts, but take it easy on the lazy, broad brush analysis. So I responded to implicit bias in the comments here. My first response was as follows. I said, it is a well-known fact that children very often copy their parents' behavior. In fact, before I go into the response, implicit bias did leave a link to support what he's saying, which was this article right here from Psychology Today, which I'll get onto in a second. But going back to my response, I said it's a well-known fact that children very often copy their parents' behavior. It's not conjecture, it's observable fact. For example, kids who grow up in a household where the parents smoke are twice as likely to be smokers than kids who grow up in a non-smoking house. A kid who grows up in a Christian house is more likely to be Christian as an adult than a kid who grows up in a non-Christian house, etc. But inexplicably, we're supposed to believe that homosexual behavior is exempt from this. That's far-fetched, to say the least. There is an agenda to promote and encourage homosexuality, particularly among young people, which is clear as day at this point. So any statistics claiming same-sex couples have no effect on a kid's sexuality have to be viewed through that lens. You're not going to get anything remotely resembling an impartial study on homosexuality from any mainstream source in the West. Implicit bias responded by saying, I don't disagree that there is an agenda of promoting different types of sexuality. I'm with you on that. But when it comes to the example you use for smoking, I believe this is a learned behavior and an extremely addictive one. However, I don't believe sexual preference falls into this bracket. It's a spectrum where you either have an underlying preference for same sex or you don't from a fairly young age. No amount of exposure to gay culture is going to make a fully straight person gay. If you're in the bi section of the spectrum, then maybe. So I responded by saying, there is absolutely zero proof at all that homosexuality can't be a learned behavior. I've always said that I'm open to the possibility that some people are actually born gay. But I've also seen mountains of evidence which strongly indicate, beyond a reasonable doubt in my mind, that homosexuality can also be a learned behavior in some cases. There are men, for example, who take no interest in other men sexually, but they wind up going to prison, get raped in prison repeatedly, or turned out, as it's sometimes called. And oftentimes, many of these men, after leaving prison, continue engaging in homosexual activity of their own free will, long after they've been released. I've also come across countless cases over the years of gay men who openly state that their homosexual urges stemmed from childhood sexual abuse at the hands of a same-sex adult. And before I continue reading my response here, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Now, the first example I ever came across of this was an interview that I read in one of the Caribbean newspapers in the UK. It was either The Voice or The New Nation. And one of them had this interview with a mixed race guy who at the time must have been in his 40s or 50s. This was in the early 2000s, I think. He's the late 90s or early 2000s when I read this interview. And this guy, this mixed race, British, half Nigerian, half white guy, said that he had lived his whole adult life, or from his teenage years, as a homosexual. But he said that he never was homosexual in the beginning, but his homosexual behavior stemmed from being sexually abused in boarding school. I think he said he was even raped in boarding school and sexually abused by other boys. And rather than face what had actually happened to him, that he got violated, that he had literally his manhood taken away from him, and he was turned into a woman in that situation, he was being penetrated by other males, and he didn't want to be. He basically said that he couldn't deal with what had happened to him. So it was easier for him, from a psychological point of view, to tell himself that he was gay. That was the way, his way of coping with it, of trying to rationalize what had happened. And as a result, he said he went into a gay lifestyle after that incident. So there was him. That was the first time I came across something like that. That's what put that seed in my head, that this might be happening to a lot of people who end up identifying as gay. And over the years, I've come across countless similar cases. A lot of them are actually public figures, all right? Don Lemon, who is a well-known news anchor in the United States, a black guy. He, if you go to his Wikipedia page, says that he was sexually abused as a child by a man. There was also a internet sensation a few years ago called Antoine Dodson, okay? A very overtly homosexual camp individual, black American. And after, initially finding this internet fame and being this openly camp gay individual, he basically renounced his homosexuality a couple years later, said that he was getting married to a woman and turning Christian. And he then revealed in a YouTube video that he'd actually been raped when he was, I think, like 11 years old or something like that by a man. And he says that, again, his homosexual urges were very much influenced by that incident when he got raped. Okay, so I could go on because I've been, taking note of these incidents since the early 2000s. Of all these incidents of these homosexual men who say that their homosexual urges began with some kind of abuse. Prior to that, they had no attraction at all to the same sex. But after that incident, it changed something in them. It had some kind of profound psychological effect on them. Anyway, let me continue with the response. I said there's even a study that was done by a professor at the University of New Zealand by a woman called Elizabeth Wells, Professor Elizabeth Wells, which found a link between homosexuality and childhood abuse. As in, those who suffer childhood abuse are more likely to become homosexual as adults. And just to show you the article briefly, which talks about that. Where are we at here? Here we go from the New Zealand Herald. Childhood abuse and homosexuality linked in study. And it references this study. Let's have a look at, here we go. Study researcher, Associate Professor Elizabeth Wells said that the more adverse events experienced in childhood, the more likely someone was to belong to the groups other than heterosexual. Okay, and when it comes to those adverse events in childhood, among those would be sexual assault, rape, violence to the child, etc. So this is an academic. This is a proper study. If you want to see the actual paper, it's here. Okay, on a government website in New Zealand. And the findings of this study strongly suggest that you can influence somebody's sexuality through putting them, when you put them through certain types of trauma in childhood. That if they go through certain types of trauma in childhood, there is a much higher likelihood that they'll turn out gay. Okay, so this strongly suggests that homosexuality in many cases is not something that everybody who's gay is born with. That you can actually be born with, with a tendency to be straight, but through childhood trauma, it can then change you and you end up gay. All right, and I'll come back to this because this is today called sexual fluidity. Okay, even the mainstream academia now acknowledges that there is such a thing as sexual fluidity. Now, getting back to my response. So I referenced the study by Professor Elizabeth Wells, which I've talked about many times before in previous episodes. I go on to say, everything I've seen and researched indicates that you're dead wrong. Homosexuality can absolutely be a learned behavior, as can countless other things. And it's not solely an innate instinct. I would assume that suffering abuse would have a greater impact on sexuality than growing up with same-sex parents, but that certainly doesn't mean that there would be no impact at all. During their formative years, children are extremely impressionable and they copy a lot of their parents' behavior. Some of these behaviors can endure long into adulthood. A young boy seeing two men kissing at home could easily result in that child trying to emulate that behavior among his male friends at school. And in a snowball effect, it could spill over into adulthood. In the modern world, many young males grow up frustrated with the opposite sex, consuming drugs and alcohol, which, by the way, are far more prevalent in the gay community. And yes, you can look that up even in mainstream sources and find that out to be true. In the gay community, there is a far, far higher rate of, drug and alcohol abuse than there is among the general population of straight people. I mean, I read, and I've posted this on Patreon before, several mainstream articles which talk about studies that show that in the gay community, frequent drug use is 7 times higher than it is among the general population. Okay? Anyway, getting back to the response, these frustrated young males who grow up in modern society, who maybe have a difficult relationship with the opposite sex, if they are raised in a household where they have same-sex parents, like 2 daddies, the cumulative influence of that, combined with the frustration in dealing with the opposite sex, and of course, the promotion of homosexuality, the combination of all these factors could influence a frustrated young male to try the homosexual route. Sexuality absolutely can change due to outside influences, life experiences, or even chemical influences. Okay? And again, that goes, that's referencing sexual fluidity. It says here in the Wikipedia article regarding sexual fluidity is one or more changes in sexuality or sexual identity, sometimes known as sexual orientation identity. Okay? Sexual orientation is stable and unlikely to change for the vast majority of people, but some research indicates that some people may experience change in sexual orientation, and this is more likely for women than men. Okay? Now, what they don't talk about is what influences are likely to change somebody's sexuality. Okay, and I've already alluded to some of the influences. There can be chemical influences. There can be trauma in childhood. There can be trauma in adulthood. There can be frustration. I mean, there are men who go into prison, not just the ones who are victimized and, end up being raped. There are some men who go into prison, never had a homosexual experience in their lives, never been attracted to males before in their lives. But in the unnatural confinement of prison, their hormones are raging. They don't have any sexual outlet. It can create a chemical imbalance in the brain, it would seem. And they need some kind of sexual outlet, so they turn on other men. Now, this is a minority of men who do this, but they're still there. And these are men who have never previously had any kind of homosexual encounter, but they end up doing it in prison. We see it with pet dogs, for example. Any of you who have ever owned male dogs, if the male dog doesn't have access to a female dog, very often what do they start doing? They start humping anything that moves. They'll hump your leg. They'll try hump you. They'll try hump the table leg. They'll try hump toy, teddy bears and toy animals and stuff like that. They go a bit cuckoo, a bit crazy when they can't get their sexual fix. And they'll just try hump anything. But if you actually put them in a more natural environment and gave them access to female dogs, they'd hump the female dogs instead. That's what they really want to do. But in this unnatural situation where they don't have access to the opposite sex of their own species, they're just going to try and hump anything. And from what I've seen and what I've studied, the same can happen with many men in unnatural environments like prison, in the military, and even in society when you have these males who, not very successful with women. And certainly if they're raised by two men and they're raised in a gay household and all this kind of business, it could have a profound effect on them. If they were raised by two men and they saw them kissing each other and stuff like that, that is going to be an option in their head, more so than people who, and I'm talking in general terms here, more so than people who are raised by, male and female parents rather than same-sex parents. Now, going back to the article, which implicit bias reference, right? This article says, parents matter, but they don't make a difference. DNA is the major systematic force that makes us who we are. Now, this right here is a broad, what did implicit bias describe it as? Let me see here. Lazy broad brush analysis. No disrespect, implicit bias, but I think what you've actually done is lazy broad brush analysis. Okay, acting as though it's all nurture, it's no nature. That's extremely lazy broad brush analysis. Now, I don't need anybody with letters after their name to tell me about human nature because I've observed it myself. 4 decades living on this planet. I've got 5 brothers. I come from a big family. I've got a big extended family. Grew up with lots of, kids in the house, not only younger siblings and cousins and stuff like that, but my mom for a brief time was also a childminder, so the house was always full of kids. So I've grown up observing human behavior all my life. I know the influences that kids can take from their parents and from their peer group. Certain things that I've observed without any person with letters after his name having to tell me is that in the formative years, when you're very young, when you're preschool all the way up to young primary school particularly, when you're that kind of age, let's say, from birth to maybe 7, during those years, you take far more influence from your parents than you do after those years. Once you get into secondary school and stuff like that, in the Western world, in the modern Western world, a lot of people are going to start taking more influence from their peer group than they are from their parents. Okay? So it's not so black and white as you either take more influence from your peer group or you take more influence from your parent. It's not so black and white. It's dependent upon the age group, first of all. Secondly, if you want, I don't need mainstream articles or anything like that to convince me because I have my own brain and I have my own eyes and I can do my own observation and my own analysis. But this is for your benefit, all right? If you want mainstream articles which refute what this individual is saying, here you go. This is from Psych Central. And this article says that a new study of Australian preschoolers and Kalahari Bushman children finds that a particular kind of imitation, over-imitation, in which a child copies everything an adult shows them, not just the steps that lead to some outcome, appears to be a universal human activity. It says here, developmental psychologists have always known children learn by imitating adults. Of course they do. Anybody who's been around children will know. Young children, they're constantly imitating what the parents are doing. It's not conjecture. And they'll imitate all kinds of stuff. As this study revealed, kids will imitate the most bizarre things that they see adults doing. Even when these things make no sense, they'll still imitate it. So the article goes on to say, researchers believe the work sheds light on how humans develop and transmit culture. It says here, scientists have been finding this odd effect where children will copy everything that they see an adult demonstrate to them, even if there are clear or obvious reasons why those actions would be irrelevant, says psychologist Mark Nielsen of the University of Queensland in Australia. It's something that we know that other primates don't do. If a chimpanzee is shown an irrelevant action, they won't copy it. They'll skip right to the action that makes something happen. So that right there, a mainstream article, which is telling you what you should already know through observation. If you're paying attention, the kids copy adults. Particularly in their formative years, they'll copy adults down to the finest detail of what they're doing. But yet you're trying to suggest implicit bias. You're trying to suggest that a young kid who grows up seeing two men kissing at home is not going to try and emulate that behavior when he's around his male friends. The young boy's not going to emulate that behavior. Now they copy all kinds of other behavior, but they're not going to emulate that behavior. Well, that doesn't seem very realistic to me. I mean, just to give you an example of some of the behaviors that children copy from adults, particularly their parents. Here we have another article which says researchers study intergenerational transmission of criminal behavior. It says, in general, children of criminal parents are more than twice as likely to exhibit criminal behavior themselves. So if the parents are criminals, the children are more likely to become criminals themselves because the children copy the parents. They'll even follow the parents into crime. Another example. This is from the University of Washington. It says children whose parents smoke are twice as likely to begin smoking than offspring of non-smokers. No surprises there. You would have seen this through observation. Another article here. Children who watch parents drink are twice as likely to binge on alcohol. No surprise to me, right? Children will copy what their parents are doing. If their parents are alcoholic, it doesn't mean that every child with alcoholic parents is going to become an alcoholic. No, it just means there's a greater likelihood that they become binge drinkers or alcoholics if they witness their parents doing it growing up. Another example. This is from the Nova Recovery Center, which I believe is some kind of clinic for substance abusers. Here it says that children of substance abuse in parents are more than twice as likely to have drug and alcohol use disorders by young adulthood as compared to their peers. No surprise to me. Kids grow up seeing their seeing their parents abusing drugs, are more likely to abuse drugs themselves. Learned behavior. Now, to give you an even more extreme example of the kind of things that kids can be taught to do, a very extreme example. This is an article from The Guardian from several years ago. Well, got over 10 years ago now. The headline reads, Global Outcry at Taliban's Use of Boy in Filmed Beheading. So there was a grisly video which came out several years ago, which purported to be from Afghanistan, where a young boy who could have been no older than 12 was filmed beheading a grown man. Now, I have researched child soldiers in Africa, child soldiers in, various third world countries. And these young kids, some of them much younger than 12, are partaking in torture, murder, gruesome acts of violence where they're gouging people's eyes out and chopping people up while they're still alive, peeling their skin, all kinds of crazy stuff. Now, if you can teach a child, if torturing people can be a learned behavior for a child, and that's something extreme. Beheading people, that can be a learned behavior for a child. Extreme stuff. I mean, no normal 12-year-old, 8, 9-year-old could even watch somebody being tortured or beheaded without being deeply traumatized, horrified, and frightened to death. Most kids couldn't even watch that. Most adults couldn't even watch that. But if you get a child, particularly in their formative years, you can desensitize them to this kind of thing. Not only desensitize them, but you can but they can actually learn to enjoy inflicting pain on people. I remember watching a documentary about child soldiers. I think it was in Sierra Leone. And they interviewed some of these former child soldiers. And as adults, they said, well, I just enjoy hurting people. Well, they wouldn't have been like that if they'd grown up in a normal, loving family and hadn't been, abducted as young kids and witnessed all kinds of atrocities and horrors. So if kids can enjoy, can be conditioned to enjoy things as extreme as torturing, killing, raping, and beheading people, what on earth makes you think that they can't learn homosexual behavior? Kids can learn, virtually any kind of behavior can be learned if you put kids around it. Yeah, because particularly with young children, their brain is like a sponge. That is when the personality is most malleable, in the very early formative years. Once somebody is, from teenage all the way up into adulthood, it's not impossible to change them, of course, but the older they get, generally, the more difficult it is to mold somebody or change them. But if you get them very young, you can have a profound effect on their personality, a long-lasting effect, long into adulthood, if you get them young enough. I can't remember which famous figure it was from history, but they said words to the effect of, give me a child from birth until the age of 7, and I will give you the man. So the implication is, I will literally create this person. I will create their personality, or I will certainly have a strong influence over the person they become as an adult by, programming them between the ages of 0 to 7. Yeah. So the whole nature versus nurture thing, of course, we have certain innate behaviors and characteristics that, we inherit genetically, including a sexuality, but you can definitely influence someone's sexuality. Oh, yes, you can. That's where sexual fluidity comes from. Most people's sexuality is not going to change throughout life, but homosexuals are a minority of the population, people. According to the Office of National Statistics, homosexuals in the UK are like 2% of the population or less. So we're talking about a minority of the population to begin with when we're talking about homosexuals. And everything I've observed and everything I've studied over the years strongly indicates that many homosexuals were not born that way. There were certain events that occurred in their lives. There were certain outside influences, certain things they saw, or certain things that happened to them that caused them to go down that road. Yeah? So, yeah, there's the article that talked about it again, referring to the study by Elizabeth Wells at that university in New Zealand. So yeah, the whole nature versus nurture thing, it's not either or, implicit bias is both. And, I see no, empirical evidence for what you're saying at all. You're saying there's zero evidence that bringing kids up, in a same-sex household where you got two, same-sex parents, zero evidence that it has an effect on the sexuality. Well, there's zero evidence that it doesn't. How about that? There's zero evidence that it doesn't. And everything that I've observed and studied over the years, including all, the article. And by the way, articles like this are few and far between. In the Western world, as there is in all societies, to be fair, academia, medicine, the education system have to operate within the parameters set out by the state. So if you were growing up in Nazi Germany and you were a scientist or whatever, if your scientific findings didn't correlate or didn't jive or fit in with the Nazi master race ideology or propaganda, whatever you want to call it, if your findings didn't correlate with that, well, you're going to be marginalized or worse as a scientist. Or if you're some kind of, academic or psychologist or whatever the case may be, your findings, your scientific findings had to jive with the propaganda that the Nazi machine was pushing. The same thing goes in the Western world today. Don't kid yourself that, you know, journalists or scientists or academics, teachers are not constrained as well in Britain and America and, you know, countries around the world. Of course they are. They have to operate within certain parameters. And to hell with any evidence, no matter how compelling it is, which contradicts the direction that the state wants the society to go in. I mean, I've given this example before, but in the Western world now, you can go to your doctor and tell the doctor that you don't feel like you belong in your body. You were born as a male, but you feel like you should be a female. You will have absolutely no problem getting some surgeon to cut your penis off, pump you full of hormones, and you know, make you a transgender. They will happily let that happen for you. You'll get loads of help in assisting you to cut your penis off and mutilate your body and pump yourself full of these hormones, artificial hormones, right? But if you go to the doctor and you're a homosexual and you tell the doctor, I don't want to be gay, I want help becoming straight, you'll get no help at all. And in fact, any doctor who even offered you help in doing that would probably be struck off. I mean, that right there is madness. So if you want to be straight, like 98% of the population are, you're not going to get help. If you want to cut your penis off, mutilate your body, pump yourself full of chemicals, no problem. We'll help you do that. That right there shows the bias. That right there shows that we don't have an open debate when it comes to things like transgenderism, homosexuality and stuff. There is no debate. You're not allowed to debate, you know, on a public platform. You have to go along with what the state's agenda is and the state's position on homosexuality and transgenders and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they're very firm on it. It doesn't matter what findings or what studies you bring up. They're not interested. They're just going to poo-poo all of it, sweep it all to the side. They're not interested in having a debate on it. Okay? So this is how it goes in most countries, people. If you want to get to the truth, there's no point in just bringing it up mainstream all the time. There's no point. You're going to have to actually engage your own brain, use your own discernment, and start being critical of what the mainstream is telling you if you want to get to the truth. And that goes for any country. Yeah? You have to understand that anything mainstream is going to come with a bias, whether it's mainstream media, whether it's academia, whatever the case may be. Yeah? I mean, another example of like bias within the medical profession would be many, many decades ago in the early part of the 20th century. Edward Bernays had a hand in this, by the way. Doctors were promoting smoking cigarettes because, you know, there was a lot of money being made by the tobacco companies and, you know, there was some kind of crossover between the medical profession and people who own tobacco companies and whatnot. And so they were, you know, you had doctors saying that smoking tobacco helps your respiratory system. It's what some doctors were saying. So at any point in history, there's going to be an agenda in terms of even what doctors are telling you. That's why people who just go along with the mainstream version of vaccines, for example, I'm not saying that vaccines have no health benefits at all. I'm not saying that. But what I am 100% convinced of is that many vaccines have damaging side effects, which are swept under the rug by big pharma and by the government, and that there are ulterior motives to giving vaccines. It's not just about eradicating diseases and stuff like that. I mean, the fact that certain countries are making vaccines mandatory now. I mean, I recently heard that in Germany, they're looking to make vaccines mandatory. And if you refuse to get vaccinated, you can be fined like 2,000 euros or something like that. I mean, people, if that's not sinister, I don't know what is. So what, you don't have a choice about what goes in your own body? That's insane. That's completely insane. And I want to do a different podcast, a separate podcast about the whole vaccine situation, because the logic that they try to come up with for justifying mandatory vaccinations is completely absurd. And that's really where you're going to have to engage your own brain and disconnect from groupthink and the herd mentality, because that's what gets people in trouble, is the herd mentality. The herd is like a herd of sheep. That's how the majority of people are in every society. And you're not really going to understand what's going on unless you take a step back and disconnect yourself intellectually, disconnect yourself from the herd. It's not like there's nothing that people within the herd say that's valid. There will be. But you need to be careful not to get drawn in to that zombie-like state that the herd often falls under, Anyway, I'm going to move on from all this and get to some more comments. But, as I would say, as I've already said, homosexuality, from all I've seen and studied, can absolutely be a learned behavior, as can many other things. Sexual fluidity, as far as I'm concerned, is definitely a real thing. Yeah, definitely a real thing. And there can be many, many different factors that can change somebody's sexuality throughout the course of their life. In the modern world, certainly we have to look at the chemicals that young children are ingesting, And one thing I also do want to say is that when it comes to the influence that parents have over their kids, from what I've observed in traditional societies, or even in third world cultures, which some would say are primitive cultures, parents tend to have a much stronger influence over their children of all age groups. So not just children in their very formative years, from 0 to 7, but even beyond that, into teenage years and into adulthood. In those traditional primitive cultures, the parental influence is much stronger and it lasts much longer. And the reason for this is because those primitive cultures don't change culturally much from generation to generation, which is the way it's been for most humans for the majority of human existence. Yeah, they say human beings have been around for something like 200,000 years. The majority of that time, the culture hasn't really changed much for most societies from generation to generation. So what happens is the children look up to the elders, even the grandparents, as sources of wisdom and knowledge. Yeah, because the culture which existed in their society when the grandparents were young is pretty much the same culture that exists for the grandchildren. Yeah, so they're going to look at their grandparents and say, oh, well, you can teach me a lot. But in the modern Western world, we live in this unnatural situation where culture is changing extremely rapidly, probably at an unprecedented rate at this point. It's changing so rapidly that you get this disconnect between each generation where parents don't understand their children. The children don't understand their parents, where the children are very often very dismissive of their parents. They look at their parents like, you guys are old, you don't understand. Your generation was completely different to my generation culturally. There's nothing you can teach me. They're kind of dismissive and, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word, but yeah, they're kind of like dismissive of the elders in their society. They don't respect the elders in modern Western culture the way that traditional societies do, because again, the culture that the kids exist in today is so different than their parents' culture that they existed in when they were young. All right? This creates a disconnect, but as it relates, and this is why kids will often take, in modern Western society, kids will often take more influence, particularly when they get into secondary school age. They'll take more influence from their peer group than they do from their parents once they reach them kind of ages there. But as it relates to homosexuality, that's a bit different, because homosexuality is the future in Western culture. Homosexuality is being pushed by the powers that be. They're trying to encourage it everywhere. So a child who grows up in a household would have got same-sex parents, like two dads. That child doesn't look at the same-sex parents and say, you guys are so old-fashioned. No, that child has been conditioned to look at those same-sex parents as, well, actually, you guys are progressive. You guys are the future. Do you understand? So a child, in my estimation, is less likely to rebel against that. They're more likely to embrace that because they're being conditioned by the powers that be to believe that homosexuality is a great thing and it's the way forward and it's the way of the future. Whereas with same-sex parents, particularly if it's a traditional setup at home, you know, with the traditional gender roles of mom and dad, that kind of setup is now demonized. So kids are more likely to look at that and say, I don't want to follow that. Right? So when it comes to the homosexual thing, same-sex parents, I think they're in a lot of cases, they're going to be, it's going to encourage them to go down that path, or it's certainly going to increase the likelihood that they could go down that path because it's encouraged in society in general. So if they see it at home as well, it's even more of an influence on them to go down that road, you know? So yeah, that's what I'll say about all that. Moving on to other comments here, but shout out to Implicit Bias. Implicit Bias was going back and forth with Penny's 94. Okay, comment here from Carly Woodbridge. Shout out to Carly. And big up Carly, by the way, for telling me about the guy who does shirts and stuff like that. The website link you gave me to the guy for merchandise and stuff like that. Shout out to Carly. But she says, the one that got me is when Hatman said to men, they shouldn't date a woman that earns more than them. Get the fuck out of here. So do we, A, address that these guys feel inadequate and give up our high paying jobs to make the guys be the sole breadwinner, or B, find a guy that earns even more than we do, then we'll be called shallow and gold digging? So I responded to Carly by saying, it's got nothing to do with the man feeling inadequate. It's about how the woman views the man. Mutual dependency is what makes most successful marriages work. When there is no mutual dependency, the chances of success are greatly reduced. If a woman is earning more than a man, then she doesn't need him. In other words, he's expendable. This is why in the West, divorce rates are so high and single parent households are so common, because there's no longer mutual dependency between most couples. If you visit a country where men are still the primary breadwinners, you'll see divorce rates are much lower and single parent families are fewer. Carly responded by saying, isn't it better to want your husband rather than need him? Surely, if you are independent and have your own money and want to stay with him, that's out of real love, rather than ensuring you have food and a house, etc. So I responded by saying, better for what exactly? The proof is in the pudding at the end of the day, and mutual dependency has a proven track record in producing successful marriages and strong families. Relying on quote unquote real love, as you call it, rather than mutual dependency has a very poor track record. In the West, we are conditioned to look for true love when in reality, most people never find it. It's a pipe dream. It's pie in the sky. The traditional way of doing things is more grounded in reality and practicality rather than some whimsical fairy tale. What the Western world calls true love is not really true love at all in my book. It's just romantic infatuation, which is very often fleeting. It fades over time. Successful marriages have to be based on something a lot more solid and dependable than that. In a traditional society, the husband and wife go into the marriage with clearly defined roles, knowing exactly what's expected of them. There's no surprises. You are there to play your position and work for the greater good. And during that process, respect and love grows between the two. That method has worked for thousands of years because it caters for and complements our natural instincts. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, to expand on that response and to, address some of Carly's points in greater detail. First of all, Carly, you said that, do we address these guys who feel inadequate and give up our high-paying jobs and make them the sole breadwinner? No. It all depends on what your goal is, Carly, in life and in relationships. All right. If you are career driven and you want to make all the money and be independent and all that kind of stuff, and you're not interested in being a traditional woman, go ahead and do that. I'm not about trying to oppress anybody, or, I'm not advocating that women be forced to be housewives or anything like that. If you want to be a career woman or be a scientist or a politician, whatever you want to be, you go ahead and do that. All I'm saying is you can observe this for yourself. Look at societies where they still have the traditional families where men are the primary breadwinners. In those societies, you find far more successful marriages. You find far lower divorce rates. You find stronger communities. So it all depends on what you want. If you want the best chance of having a long-lasting, successful marriage, a strong family, and a strong community, your best chance of getting that is going the traditional route. Because the traditional route and the traditional family structure complements our natural instincts and our natural innate gender roles. Okay? So it all depends on what you want. Now, the second point you made there about, finding somebody who earns more than you and you're worried about being called a shallow gold digger. Well, I've got no issue, and I've always said this, I've got no issue with any woman who is looking for a man who earns more than them, who is interested in how much a man earns, interested in, what kind of job he does and whether he's got his shit together. That's the way they refer to it these days. I've got no issue with a woman who wants all that from a man, as long as she's willing to keep up her end of the bargain. Because if you're looking for those things in a man, you're basically looking for the man to fulfill his traditional gender role as the provider. No issue with that. But you then have to keep up your end of the bargain, which means your traditional gender role is that you are the person who takes care of the domestic duties in the house, the cooking, the cleaning, spending a lot of time with the kids while the man's working. Not to say the man shouldn't spend time with his kids too. He obviously should. Right? My dad spent plenty of time with me. So if the woman is willing to keep up her end of the bargain and let's say be a housewife, I've got no issue with her seeking a man who earns however much money she wants him to earn. No issue with that at all. That's not a gold digger. A gold digger is a woman who is looking for a man that has money, wants to be pampered, wants the man to spend money on her, and she's not willing to do anything in return. She just wants to take selfies. She might have sex with him every now and again, but she ain't going to lift a finger in the house. She's going to pass off, child raising duties and stuff like that to grandma or to a childminder or something a lot of the time, so she can go out raving or take holidays with her girls and all that kind of stuff. That's a gold digger. Yeah. But a woman who is looking for a man that has money, who is confident, he's the quintessential protector and provider, he's got it going on for himself. I've got no issue for a woman, no issue with a woman looking for that in a man. It's natural for a woman. And I'm talking in general terms here, all right? Not every single woman is going to want this, but generally speaking, this is what most women are looking for, is a man who's a protector and provider. Now, of course, women are being conditioned in the modern age. As I mentioned earlier, culture is changing so much and there are so many outside influences which are trying to turn the traditional natural gender roles on their head. They're confusing young people and confusing their instincts, etc. But even among the new generation, you still see remnants of these natural instincts coming out. Yeah, many young girls, even in today's generation, are still attracted to masculine strength, masculine confidence, a guy who's got it going on, a guy who has high social standing, a guy who can take care of himself, a guy who's above a certain height. These are things that men don't tend to look for so much in a woman. You see, the sexes are different. We don't look for the same qualities, generally speaking, in the opposite sex. Men tend to be far less interested in what a woman's, bank balance is saying. Yeah, I've got 5 brothers. I've got, most of my friends are male, and it's been that way most of my life. Okay, I've got female friends too, and I've had female friends. Most of my friends are male. And I've got 5 brothers. Grew up in a very male household, lots of male cousins and stuff like that. Never in my life as I've been sitting around talking to my brothers or, male members of my family or friends, and heard one of my friends come out and say, oh yeah, I found this girl, man. I really want to get with her. She's got this amazing job and she's got this amazing house and blah. I've never in my life heard a man say that in terms of in person. I know there are some weirdo guys out there who go after women with money. Them off-key dudes go after old women with money and stuff like that. Them men are few and far between, and that is not the normal way for a man to be. Yeah. Generally, men don't care if the woman is making no money. The natural instinct of a man is to be the protector and provider. That's the natural instinct. Yeah. I mean, you just look at the way a man and a woman would react to seeing somebody who's broken down on a motorway, for example. This is where the whole damsel in distress thing comes from, right? So if a man is broken down at the side of the motorway, women drive past and see this guy broken down on the side of the motorway. In most instances, no woman is going to stop and help this guy. But if you put a woman, particularly a pretty woman, in that same situation, she's broken down on the hard shoulder on the motorway, I'm telling you now, especially if she's pretty, there are going to be multiple guys who try and stop and help that woman. Men are attracted to that role of being the protector, coming and, saving the woman and the damsel in distress. This appeals to a man's innate instincts of being the protector. Yeah? So it's like, back in the days, they would refer to a woman as being fair. They would refer to the woman as being the opposite of the man. The man is rough, the man is coarse, the woman is fair, and she's gentle. It's the opposites being attracted to each other. Yeah. And certainly when you get a very alpha, masculine, confident male like myself, I'm not attracted to a female who's like me. I'm attracted to a female who in many ways is the opposite of me. Because I'm on, I guess some would say, the extreme end of the masculine spectrum. All right. Opposites attract. So I tend to be attracted to very feminine females, the opposite of me, because they have qualities that I lack. I'm not looking for a woman to be my business partner. I've got friends who could be my business partner, male and female friends. All right. I don't need a business partner. I'm looking for a woman who can make my house a home. I'm looking for a woman who can teach my daughters how to cook, how to look after a house, how to be a woman, how to radiate that feminine energy. I don't need another individual coming into my house who's just trying to be a knockoff version of me. I don't need that. That's too much of one kind of energy. I need the other kind of energy, the feminine energy, the mothering energy. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not interested in no career woman or any of this kind of shit. What do I want with a career woman? I've already got a career. I'm already making enough money. I don't need nobody to help me with that. I've got friends and business associates, I can do that with them. I'm looking for a woman who has that feminine energy. Yeah? That mothering energy. Someone who I can look at and say, yeah, this will be a great mum for my kids. That's what I'm looking for. So again, if you want to be a businesswoman and all that kind of stuff and career driven and you don't want to be in the house and doing all that traditional stuff, you go ahead and do that. But certainly men like me, we're not looking for a woman like that. And many women are not looking for a woman like that. They just end up having to settle for a woman like that in modern society, because men in Western society have become expendable in the eyes of many women. They don't need them. So many women are earning plenty of money. A lot of the time they're earning more money than men, certainly in the black community, in the Caribbean community particularly. You've got Caribbean women in the UK earning a lot more money than Caribbean men. So the Caribbean men, a lot of the time, have become obsolete. All the women will come and check them for is maybe some sex every now and again. And other than that, they don't give a shit about them. And that's a generalization, but it's generally true. All right. So the men in that position, I mean, they're losing. They're on the ropes. This is why I always give the advice that if you're looking for, it's not about emotion, Carly. It's about what works. If a man is with a woman and she earns more than him, she is not going to look at him. Generally speaking, she's not going to look at him with the same kind of respect that she would have for him if he earned a lot more than she earned. I mean, I remember, for example, Mel B, when she married that backup dancer. Remember that? I mean, everybody knew that weren't going to last. She was earning, 100 times more than him. Didn't last long, did it? Even more recently, there's a female comedian whose work I really love. African female comedian called Kansimi Ann. Big fan of her work. And she was married. She's very successful. She's a businesswoman and, making loads of money. And she married a guy a few years ago who was a university lecturer. And I knew as soon as she got married, I said to my girl at the time, well, that's not going to last long. She's earning 50 times more than he's earning. It's not going to work. She's not going to have enough respect for him. And lo and behold, even though she was raised in a very traditional African family, because of the fact that she's way more successful and earns way more money than him, it didn't work out. When the woman is earning more money than you, she don't need you. You're expendable. There's no mutual dependency. If she starts acting up, if she starts being disrespectful, and she's earning more money than you, and you try to check her for her disrespect, more often than not, she's going to tell you to fuck off. That's just what's going to happen most of the time. But if you're earning more than her, especially if you're earning significantly more, and she's being disrespectful or acting up, and then you check her, more often than not, she's going to say, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. Because she doesn't want to lose the lifestyle that she can have when she's with you. She doesn't want to end up being kicked to the curb, particularly if she got kids with you, raising them kids in some council house. She don't want that. She likes being with you because of the lifestyle that you can offer her and the lifestyle you can offer the kids. I mean, it's so extreme in terms of the effect that earning more money has on a woman. It's so extreme that certainly in my day, and it's different now in the social media generation, because a lot of these celebrity men, they end up getting a girlfriend or a wife who wasn't previously famous. And this girlfriend or wife then uses the man to launch their own career as some kind of Instagram model or, social media celebrity. So it's a bit different now, which is why I always tell any man who is any kind of public figure, you need to keep your woman well away from the public eye. If you don't want problems in your relationship, you need to keep her out of the public eye. Don't put her on public display. All right. In my day, before social media and before the internet, most male celebrities who had, wives and girlfriends who were not famous, when these male celebrities would cheat on the wife and treat them like shit and all that kind of stuff, 9 times out of 10, these girlfriends and wives wouldn't go anywhere. they would stick around to be cheated on, to be beaten, to be disrespected, and they wouldn't go anywhere, even though they're free to go wherever they want. They weren't, being tied down to the, chained to the radiator or to the cooker. No, they could have gone at any time, but they chose to stay because of the lifestyle that the guy was giving them. That's why they chose to stay. Now, of course, in situations where there's no prenup, some of them would try a thing and try to take half. But in situations where there is a prenup, and I always advocate prenups, in situations where there is a prenup, see, this is why these women will fight so hard and guilt trip the man so much when he tries to offer a prenup. Because they want the opportunity to leave with half his shit. So don't get in that opportunity. And as I say, back in the days, men who put prenup in place, who were celebrities, men, and I'm not advocating the man treat the woman like shit at all. I'm just showing you that the woman will behave herself, right? If you earn way more than she earns. It's just female nature, human nature. That's just how it goes. So it's not about, inadequacies or anything like that. It's about doing what works. And it's very observable that if you earn a lot more than the woman, there is less chance that she's going to go anywhere. There's less chance that she's going to be disrespectful. There's less chance that she's going to act up if you earn a lot more than she earns. So as a man, particularly in modern society where women are being encouraged through social media and through, social conditioning, they're being encouraged to be increasingly vain and narcissistic, it's even more important than it's ever been to make sure that you get with a woman who earns a lot less money than you. It's more important now than it's ever been. That right there is I don't want to say an insurance policy, but it certainly lessens the chances that the woman is going to disrespect you or start acting up in any kind of way. Yeah. So that's what I'll say to you there, Carly. You go ahead and do your thing. You want to be a career woman and all that. I got no problem with it. But if you want to give yourself the best chance, and it's not about what's fair, it's about what works. Yeah. But if you want to give yourself the best chance of being in a successful relationship, then the traditional route is the tried and tested method that has been working for thousands of years. This new version of the family where it's 50-50 everything and you both take turns in doing housework and, you both take turns in cooking and you both take turns in, dealing with the kids, that goes against the natural instincts of male and female. Where the woman can earn more than the man and all this kind of stuff. Again, it goes against the natural instincts. Generally, male and female are attracted to different qualities in the opposite sex, not the same qualities. And the traditional marriage, the traditional family structure supports and caters to our natural instincts. This new family structure, where it's all 50-50 and we're all doing the same roles and that there's no clearly defined gender roles within the marriage, that goes against our natural instincts, which is why, in my estimation and my observation, it doesn't work. At least it doesn't work as often as the traditional family structure works, as the traditional family unit. It doesn't work as often. It's not rocket science. You know what I mean? It's like with lions, for example, right? You've got the male lion who has a particular role within the pride, and then you've got the female lions, the lionesses. Now, the male lion, when he's adolescent, he doesn't have his own pride. So he's in the wilderness. Sometimes he'll team up with one or two other male lions and they'll go hunting and stuff like that. And then when that young male lion reaches a certain age, he will go around challenging other male lions who do have their own pride to a fight. And if he can win the fight and beat that male lion who is in charge of whatever pride, he then takes that male lion's position. And that male lion who was previously the alpha of the pride, he gets kicked to the curb by his own pride. And very often, particularly if it's an old male lion, and particularly if he suffered serious injuries in the fight, he'll often go off and die by himself alone. That's what you call paying the cost to be the boss. Because when a male lion is the head of his pride, he gets certain privileges. He doesn't have to go out hunting. The lionesses do that. Yeah? When the lionesses bring the kill back, the male lion, the alpha male lion of the pride, he gets to eat first. Yeah? But that's the privilege he gets for being the boss, but he also has to pay the cost. So that male lion has to fight all the time. He gets these challenges from these other male lions who want to take his place. The female lions, the lionesses, they ain't getting challenges from outside the pride. For the most part, their place within the pride is guaranteed for life in most cases. They've got that stability. They've got that assurance that they've always got these other lions around them to help them out. But the male lion, the alpha male of the pride, his position is very tenuous, right? Which is why he gets these certain privileges, because he has to pay a heavy cost. If he loses a certain fight, all the females reject him, and often, or at least sometimes, when a new male lion takes over the pride and the old male lion gets kicked out, the new head of the pride will sometimes kill the offspring of the previous alpha male. That's how harsh it is, you know? So it's not fair, but it's what works. Now, obviously, that's an extreme example. And as human beings, we're not trying to act on all of our animal instincts. It's not practical, right? We do think on a higher level, well, some of us do, than animals. But at the same time, we do have animal and natural instincts. So it's not good to act on all our animal instincts, but at the same time, it's not good to ignore and suppress all of our animal instincts. That's not good either. You have to find a healthy balance. And I keep going back to it with regards to the gender roles and all that kind of stuff. The traditional family unit is what works. Yeah. The new family unit that they're trying to create, from what I can see from all the statistics, I mean, you look at the Western world, it's not good. So it all depends on how much you want a successful relationship, Carly. How good a chance you want to give yourself to have a successful marriage or a successful relationship. If you want to give yourself the best chance, the traditional way is the way to go. If you don't want it that much, if you're happy, taking your chances because you want to keep hold of your career and you're not interested in being traditional, again, that's your choice. But you probably find that it's a lot more difficult to have a long-lasting marriage or relationship going in that direction. Yeah, maybe you might be able to find the right kind of beta male or metrosexual or something, and keep him. I don't know. I'm not just talking to you, Carly. I'm talking to ladies in general. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that. But before I end this, I just want to briefly pick up on a couple of things I missed out on saying with regards to implicit bias in his comments. Another example of learned behavior, which I've spoken about before, something I've observed in my own life, is, for example, one of my ex-girlfriends, her sister was being beaten by her baby dad. Okay, this is many, many years ago. And it was happening so frequently that their son started copying that behavior. And he started beating his sister the same way that he was seeing his dad beat his mum. And he was even going to school and he started hitting girls at school. Again, copying the behavior of his dad, hitting his mum. That is how profound an effect, the adults can have on their children by way of their children copying the adult behavior. Now, I've noticed that in mainstream Western academia and, medicine and psychology and all that kind of stuff, they don't like talking about the vicious cycle that can sometimes be created by abuse. They don't like talking about that. But that absolutely exists. All right? They try and come out with studies and articles which refute this, in what is, in my view, fact that kids who come from an abusive household are more likely to become abusers themselves. Okay? I mean, I observed in my life that kids who get bullied are more likely to become bullies. It doesn't mean that all kids who get bullied become bullies. Okay? It just means they're more likely to become bullies. It's a learned behavior a lot of the time. Sometimes it's not, but a lot of the time it is. But there's this, particularly in this politically correct world we live in, there is this reluctance in mainstream medicine and academia and all that kind of stuff in the Western world to look upon victims with suspicion. You know, because some would say the reasoning for this is they don't want to make the victims feel like they're being, you know, watched and demonized, etc. So they don't want to talk about this transferal of abuse, this intergenerational transferal of abuse, these cycles of abuse that can exist, where the person who's bullied goes on to be the bully. The person who gets sexually molested has a higher chance of becoming, you know, a pedophile, etc. It's very taboo and they don't like talking about it. But from all I've observed, that very much is the case. In decades gone by, they were far more frank and honest about it. But now they try and sweep it under the rug and pretend it's not happening, which is absurd because it doesn't correlate with all the other things I brought up, right? The fact that kids who come from, you know, households where there's criminal parents are more than twice as likely to become criminals themselves. Kids with parents that smoke, more likely to smoke. Kids with parents who binge drink on alcohol are more likely to binge drink. You know, kids who have parents on drugs are more likely to take drugs themselves. So on and so forth. But we're supposed to believe that kids who get sexually abused are not more likely to become sexual abusers. Kids who witness domestic violence are not more likely to, you know, engage in domestic violence themselves as adults. I mean, the guy I talked about several months ago, who I knew personally, who went to jail for killing his baby mom, he grew up in an abusive household. He grew up in a house where his dad was beating the shit out of his mom. And he went on to stab to death the mother of his daughter. So there is such a thing as cycles of abuse, people. It's just this bizarre thing certainly in the UK, where they don't want to acknowledge that cycles of abuse is a real thing, that you can inherit abusive behavior from your parents. It doesn't mean that the majority of people who suffer abuse are going to go on to be abusers, but certainly from what I've observed, it greatly increases the chances that you could become an abuser. If you've suffered abuse yourself growing up, or you've seen abuse yourself growing up in the home. And implicit bias, you also talked about parents having very little impact. I mean, you did say, to be fair, you're talking about adopted kids, parents having very little impact on their adopted kids. Obviously, I wasn't adopted. You said they expect some arty or creative kid, but they turn out to be sporty instead. In my own life, all right, let me show you some examples of how influential parental behavior can be. I like fishing. My mom likes fishing. My dad likes fishing. My brothers all like fishing. Guess what we all have in common? From the ages of like 4 or 5 years old, all the way up to, teenage years and beyond, we were taken fishing by our parents. What, is that a coincidence that we all like fishing? And guess what? In my extended family, the same thing. Most people like fishing because I come from a fishing family where from very young, literally from when you can walk, where we was taken down to the beach and taught how to fish. And so it's not just a case of we know how to fish. No, we grow up and we end up liking fishing. Now, if I was raised in a family where there was no fishing, I would be far less likely to like fishing as an adult. I mean, come on, man. Parents have a massive influence over the behavior and the interests of their children. Massive influence, particularly in the very early years. Yeah, as I've already mentioned previously, in the modern society, when the children get older, the parents tend to have generally less influence over the behavior of the child. But there are certain behaviors that the children pick up in their formative years that stay with them for life. Now, some of those behaviors are, genetic, but a lot of the time they're learned behaviors that will stay with the child for life. I've certainly got certain learned behaviors from my parents and certain characteristics and ways that, from all I can tell, are genetic. Some of my idiosyncrasies I definitely get from my parents, particularly my dad. Yeah. But there are many interests that I have which were learned behaviors that I got from my parents from very young. And finally, just going back to Carly again, she spoke about gold digging women and stuff like that. As I've already mentioned, my dad was the primary breadwinner in my household growing up. He bought all my mom's cars. My mom had her own money, and as already mentioned, she did work for some years from home, part-time as a childminder. She always had her own money, but my dad, bought the house. My dad bought all her cars. My dad, did all the renovations on the house, bought all the major purchases by way of furniture and electrical goods in the house and all that kind of stuff. My dad paid for, further education for some of my siblings and stuff like that. My dad was always the primary breadwinner. And perhaps that's what my mum was looking for. My mum's not a gold digger because she kept her end of the bargain too. She cooked, she cleaned, she did all the domestic duties while my dad was out there paying for everything, working hard, making sure the bills are paid, making sure there's clothes on her back and food on the table. Whatever my mum needed by way of anything for the house, my dad was there to pay for it all. That's not a gold digger. That's two people understanding what their roles are and understanding that, look, I've got a role to play, you've got a role to play. And it's like I said in my response to you, that in traditional marriages, you know what you're getting yourself in for before you go in. You know that this is my role and that's what your role. You know what's expected of you. There's no surprises. And it's certainly no good for anybody to go into a marriage wanting something traditional, but you're not with a traditional kind of person. You can't get with a career woman and then when you're married, all of a sudden you're like, okay, can you take care of the house, please? And, do all the domestic stuff and I'll be the primary breadwinner. That's no good. You need to get with a woman who wants to be traditional in the first place. Yeah? I mean, I shouldn't really have to explain that, but there's some guys out there who are very slow on the uptake. So you need to look for a woman who wants that in the first place. Yeah? Which, as I've always said, look in traditional societies for a woman. You're going to find far more suitable candidates there. Yeah, if you're someone who likes black women, look to Africa. If you're someone who likes white women, look to Eastern Europe and, various different traditions. Even places like Italy, you still find a lot of traditional white women in Italy. So, obviously there are a lot of, diva women and modern women and vain materialistic kind of women as well there. But there's still a lot of traditional women, even in somewhere like Greece. So these are the places you should be looking. A lot of guys get caught up in this glamour and, a lot of guys are looking for the wrong kind of things in women. A lot of these young males, they don't know what a real woman is. They don't really know what makes a successful marriage or successful relationship work because they weren't raised in a successful relationship. Yeah. I was raised in a 2-parent household. My parents are still married. My aunties and uncles are all still married, apart from where the uncles have died. I mean, one of my uncles died a few years ago. He was married to my auntie who's still alive. She's in her 80s now. I mean, they were married for how many decades? Like 50 years or 60 years or something crazy like that. You know, my 2 oldest brothers are married. Both of them have got housewives, and they've been married for what? Over a decade each, I think it is now. So I was raised in a family of traditional, marriages. So I know what makes those marriages work. I've observed it. But a lot of these young boys, they're raised by these single moms, and I mean, sometimes a single mom might do a relatively good job, but a woman cannot teach a young boy how to be a man. Same way that a man cannot teach a young girl how to be a woman. It takes both energies, the masculine and the feminine energy. And of course, there are some 2-parent households, male, female 2-parent households, where both parents are clueless and both parents are terrible parents. Of course, that does happen. But generally speaking, the ideal way to raise kids is in a 2-parent house, man and a woman, in the traditional setting where there's clearly defined gender roles. That is the tried and tested method that works. So what are you interested in? Are you interested in what works? Or are you interested in fulfilling your own, fairy tale dream of what you think a relationship is supposed to be? And I think that when the powers that be, the media, feed us this fantasy of what a relationship is supposed to be, with the metrosexual man and, the career woman and all this kind of stuff, I think this is done to undermine society because they know that shit don't work. That's why they encourage us to want that kind of relationship. They know that shit don't work. The higher you go up in society, the more traditional it becomes. But they don't want us to be traditional because they want to keep us weak. That's what it's all about. That's why they encourage us to have disdain for the traditional way of doing things. That's why through women's lib and with the welfare state and all this kind of stuff, it has removed the male from the household. Yeah? Now, the woman don't need the man to protect and provide. The state will protect and provide. What the fuck she need a man for? And now, beyond the state, because we live in this tertiary economy where there's all these service jobs rather than, labor jobs, now it's far more easy for women to make lots of money than it was when it was like, coal mines and steel factories and stuff like that. That gave men a leg up in terms of the workplace, because men, obviously, in them very physically demanding jobs, are more suitable because they're physically stronger and, more robust and whatnot generally than women are. But in this tertiary economy where it's all, primarily service jobs, well, you often find that women are just as good as men at a lot of these jobs or even better. So women are making money, they're doing it, they don't need a man. And again, this has been done to undermine society. I always talk about the Nazis. Of course, the Nazis did a lot of bad things, but truth be told, they also did a lot of impressive things by way of growing the German economy. And the Nazis were able to grow the German economy incredibly quickly because Germany was literally on its knees before the Nazi party took over. And they grew the economy of Germany at an incredible speed. Not just the war machine, but the infrastructure of the country, the Autobahn. They created Volkswagen, for example, was created by the Nazis. They did so many things. Scientific advances and all kinds of stuff was done by the Nazis. It was pretty incredible. And one of the things that the Nazis promoted was the traditional gender roles. So with the traditional gender roles, they were able to get Germany off its knees and turn it into the most economically powerful country in Europe. in a very short space of time. I don't know whether that has ever been done before in the past 100 years. I don't know of any examples where a country in Europe has gone from being virtually destitute to being the most powerful country technologically and militarily in Europe in such a short space of time. And they did that by with having the traditional gender roles. That was part of what made it possible to do that, is people were delegated certain roles within the family, within society, etc. Now, of course, I'm not co-signing all the stuff that the Nazis did. They did plenty of horrible stuff. Yeah. But they also did some pretty impressive stuff at the same time. I'm just being objective about it. Yeah. And going back to the things we are conditioned to look for in a relationship, particularly with the younger generation, we are constantly conditioned to place sex very high up on our list of priorities in terms of how you make a relationship work. We're constantly bombarded with this message that you must be sexually satisfied with the person that you're with. And obviously, because everybody is so promiscuous in this day and age, particularly women, the expectations sexually are much higher now than they were in our parents' generation, generally speaking. So we're constantly being encouraged to, hold sex in very high regard and make out as though it's extremely important. And we must get this amazing, mind-blowing sex from whoever we're with. This, to me, is another example of how relationships and society and marriages are being undermined. Because if you are basing your relationship on sex, that is very shaky ground. That's like building your castle on sand. That's what it's doing when sex is like top of the list of priorities in terms of what you're looking for in a relationship. And that goes for men or women. You're a man and you just want some woman who's got a crazy head game and does all this freaky stuff in the bedroom, and that to you is more important than her character and her person. And it's not like you shouldn't, go for a woman who's attractive, of course. And it's not like being sexually satisfied is a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm just saying people place far too much emphasis on being sexually satisfied. It's a really insignificant thing in the grand scheme. It's really insignificant. What's far more important in terms of having a successful long-term marriage or relationship is that you share the same ideals. You share the same or very similar ideology. It really helps if you come from the same culture. It really helps if you're the same race. It really helps if you're the same religion. It doesn't guarantee success, but it really helps. Okay? It really helps if you've got the same ideas in terms of how you raise children. It really helps if you're on the same page with regards to male and female roles within the family and within society. Having all this common ground and, common ideology is far more important than freaky sex acts in the bedroom. Way more important. That is a far more solid foundation upon which you base your relationship. All this preoccupation with sex and orgasms and all this shit, it's all very fleeting. It's all very superficial. As is this preoccupation with romantic infatuation. What Carly is saying is real love. I wouldn't call that real love. I would call that romantic infatuation. And that, again, is fleeting. That is something that will not last. Demonstrably so. Because look at us, Carly. Look at us, most of us that grew up in the Western world. How many relationships have you had? I don't want you to answer that, Carly, all right? It's a rhetorical question. Same for me. Same for all of us, or most of us here. We've all gone from relationship to relationship to relationship to relationship. People, this is not normal. This is not healthy. In traditional societies, most people get married once, might get married twice. That's it. They're not bouncing from fucking relationship to relationship every week or every month. They ain't doing this shit. It's us who's fucked up, not them. We're fucked up. We're constantly in a state of confusion, not knowing who we're going to be with from month to month or year to year, constantly having to reevaluate and reassess and, in this state of emotional confusion. When you're trying to build a life for yourself, that's only going to be a hindrance. This is why you have that saying, behind every successful man is a strong woman. Because it really does help a man, even in his career, if he's got a woman that will support him in terms of taking care of the home, making sure the home is happy, making sure the kids are fed and, all the domestic duties are taken care of. That gives the man confidence and assurance and stability and emotional stability. It also makes him feel like he has a role and he has a purpose that he's trying to provide for his family, for the wife and the kids. It really helps a lot of men when they have that stability. When a man's constantly going for a relationship and messing with this girl, messing with that girl and this, that, and the other, it doesn't mean they can't be successful, but a lot of the time it makes it a lot more difficult. Yeah? I mean, of course, you do find men who have the wifey and they've got all these side bitches and stuff like that, but the wifey is always there. She's always there. She's always his rock. I'm not advocating that, okay? But you will often find that with successful men that they have a main chick. They've got wifey who's their rock, who's always with them. Yeah, I'm telling you, it means a lot to a lot of men to have like a steady woman who's always there, who's dependable. And those are the kind of characteristics that young men should be looking for. Somebody who's dependable. It shouldn't put so much emphasis on all the freaky sex shit and, how she looks in this dress and the Nicki Minaj wannabe selfies on Instagram and all that rubbish. That's all foolishness, boys. You don't need to be looking for none of that crap. Yeah, if you need all this freaky sex shit so much, go do that shit before you get married. Yeah? Go see a prostitute or something. You know what I mean? When it comes to wifey, you don't need to worry about none of that. Get all that out of your system before you find wifey. Because me personally, I don't want to be doing no freaky sex shit with the woman who's going to be kissing my kids. Yeah, I'm not saying I'm going to be a complete prude, but some of the shit that these guys are doing with girls is crazy. People watching all this porn and trying to do the shit that they do in the porn. Man, that's learned behavior right there. Oh, the nasty ass shit you're watching in porn movies. Now you want to do it with the woman. And that's some nasty ass shit. Do that with some hoe or do that with a brass. I don't recommend doing that with wifey, man. Personally, I've got too much respect for wifey to be doing all that shit. And in some instances, wifey might want that, but man, she's been conditioned to want that too. Some guy probably turned her out and made her do all this crazy shit. And now she's been conditioned through learned behavior to like it. So now to get off sexually, she has to do all this extreme stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's a race to the bottom. It's a downward spiral when you start going down that road. Which is why I always say another thing that you should be looking for as a man, if you can, is a woman who hasn't been out there being extremely promiscuous. Because chances are, if she's been promiscuous and stuff like that, she's going to be a bit off. So if you can, if it's possible, go for a woman that's had the least number of sexual partners. You'll find that she's generally more dependable, more stable, so on and so forth. Like I said, man, chasing this true love, chasing the soulmate. How many of you found a soulmate? Most people ain't found a soulmate. Yeah? Because the reality is, statistically, the chances of you finding a soulmate are very, very small. So why are you placing all your hopes in finding this soulmate? The thing that most people don't find. Yeah, the traditional way of doing things is far more grounded in reality. than any kind of whimsical pipe dream about finding true love and your soulmate. That's pie in the sky, man. If you find your soulmate, great. But don't put all your eggs in that basket and don't settle for anything until you find a soulmate. Man, you'll be looking forever. You end up as a lonely old person. Yeah, that's what we're conditioned to look for. This soulmate, this love at first sight shit, or, whatever the case may be. This romantic infatuation and staring into each other's eyes and wild, passionate sex and all this other shit. Man, find somebody who has the same ideology as you. Yeah, you're going to need to be attracted to them. But they don't need to be crazy, model, type attractive. That shouldn't be your emphasis, man. It should be what their ideology is, what their values are. How they see the roles of male and female. Yeah, when you go into that relationship, as I already said, you know what you're getting yourselves into. You know what's expected of you. It always helps if, when you're going into a traditional relationship, that you have the blessing of both families, that you have the blessing of the community, because it's a lot more difficult when you grow up in a community, when you're trying to have a traditional marriage or a traditional relationship in a community that's not traditional, where there's temptation everywhere, where there's, influence everywhere, pulling one person or pulling the other. That makes it a lot more difficult. So where possible, try and move to a country where they still have traditional communities. If you're looking for a woman from that country, you might want to go and live in that country, So, that's what I'll say about all that. Shout out to Carly. Shout out to everybody else who left comments. I'll catch you guys on Tuesday for the next one. I'm out.